Section 5 of the History of England, from the Accession of James II, Volume 3, Chapter 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of England, from the Accession of James II, Volume 3, Chapter 15, by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Section 5. Under our ancient sovereigns, the House of Commons rarely interfered with the executive administration. The Speaker was charged not to let the members meddle with matters of state. If any gentleman was very troublesome, he was cited before the Privy Council, interrogated, reprimanded, and sent to meditate on his undutiful conduct in the Tower. The Commons did their best to protect themselves by keeping their deliberations secret, by excluding strangers, by making it a crime to repeat out of doors what had passed within doors. But these precautions were of small avail. In so large an assembly there were always talebearers ready to carry the evil report of their brethren to the palace. To oppose the court was therefore a service of serious danger. In those days, of course, there was little or no buying of votes, for an honest man was not to be bought, and it was much cheaper to intimidate or to coerce a knave than to buy him. For a very different reason, there has been no direct buying of votes within the memory of the present generation. The House of Commons is now supreme in the state, but is accountable to the nation. Even those members who are not chosen by large constituent bodies are kept in awe by public opinion. Everything is printed, everything is discussed, every material word uttered in debate is read by 1,000,000 of people on the morrow. Within a few hours after an important division, the lists of the majority and the minority are scanned and analysed in every town from Plymouth to Inverness. If a name be found where it ought not to be, the apostate is certain to be reminded in sharp language of the promises which he has broken and of the professions which he has belied. At present, therefore, the best way in which a government can secure the support of a majority of the representative body is by gaining the confidence of the nation. But between the time when our parliaments ceased to be controlled by royal prerogative and the time when they began to be constantly and effectually controlled by public opinion, there was a long interval. After the Restoration, no government ventured to return to those methods by which, before the Civil War, the freedom of deliberation has been restrained. A member could no longer be called to account for his harangues or his votes. He might obstruct the passing of bills of supply, he might arraign the whole foreign policy of the country, he might lay on the table articles of impeachment against all the chief ministers, and he ran not the smallest risk of being treated as Maurice had been treated by Elizabeth, or Eliot by Charles I. The senator now stood in no awe of the court. Nevertheless, all the defences behind which the feeble parliaments of the 16th century had entrenched themselves against the attacks of prerogative were not only still kept up, but were extended and strengthened. No politician seems to have been aware that these defences were no longer needed for their original purpose, and had begun to serve a purpose very different. The rules, which had been originally designed to secure faithful representatives against the displeasure of the sovereign, now operated to secure unfaithful representatives against the displeasure of the people, and proved much more effectual for the latter end than they had ever been for the former. It was natural, it was inevitable, that in a legislative body emancipated from the restraints of the 16th century, and not yet subjected to the restraints of the 19th century, in a legislative body which feared neither the king nor the public, there should be corruption. The plague spot began to be visible and palpable in the days of the Cabal. Clifford, the boldest and fiercest of the wicked five, had the merit of discovering that a noisy patriot, whom it was no longer possible to send to prison, might be turned into a courtier by a goldsmith's note. Clifford's example was followed by his successors. It soon became a proverb that a parliament resembled a pump. Often the wits said, when a pump appears to be dry, if a very small quantity of water is poured in, a great quantity of water gushes out; and so, when a parliament appears to be niggardly, £10,000 judiciously given in bribes will often produce a million in supplies. The evil was not diminished, nay, it was aggravated, by that revolution which freed our country from so many other evils. The House of Commons was now more powerful than ever as against the Crown, and yet was not more strictly responsible than formerly to the nation. The government had a new motive for buying the members, and the members had no new motive for refusing to sell themselves. William, indeed, had an aversion to bribery. He resolved to abstain from it, and during the first year of his reign he kept his resolution. Unhappily the events of that year did not encourage him to persevere in his good intentions. As soon as Caermarthen was placed at the head of the internal administration of the realm, a complete change took place. He was in truth no novice in the art of purchasing votes. He had 16 years before succeeded Clifford at the Treasury, had inherited Clifford's tactics, had improved upon them, and had employed them to an extent which would have amazed the inventor. From the day on which Caermarthen was called a second time to the chief direction of affairs, parliamentary corruption continued to be practised, with scarcely any intermission, by a long succession of statesmen, till the close of the American War. Neither of the great English parties can justly charge the other with any peculiar guilt on this account. The Tories were the first who introduced the system and the last who clung to it, but it attained its greatest vigour in the time of Whig ascendancy. The extent to which parliamentary support was bartered for money cannot be with any precision ascertained, but it seems probable that the number of hirelings was greatly exaggerated by vulgar report, and was never large, though often sufficient to turn the scale on important divisions. An unprincipled minister eagerly accepted the services of these mercenaries. An honest minister reluctantly submitted, for the sake of the Commonwealth, to what he considered as a shameful and odious extortion. But during many years every minister, whatever his personal character might be, consented, willingly or unwillingly, to manage the Parliament in the only way in which the Parliament could then be managed. It at length became as notorious that there was a market for votes at the Treasury as that there was a market for cattle in Smithfield. Numerous demagogues out of power declaimed against this vile traffic, but every one of those demagogues, as soon as he was in power, found himself driven by a kind of fatality to engage in that traffic, or at least to connive at it. Now and then perhaps a man, who had romantic notions of public virtue, refused to be himself the paymaster of the corrupt crew, and averted his eyes while his less scrupulous colleagues did that which he knew to be indispensable, and yet felt to be degrading. But the instances of this prudery were rare indeed. The doctrine generally received, even among upright and honourable politicians, was that it was shameful to receive bribes, but that it was necessary to distribute them. It is a remarkable fact that the evil reached the greatest height during the administration of Henry Pelham, a statesman of good intentions, of spotless morals in private life, and of exemplary disinterestedness. It is not difficult to guess by what arguments he and other well-meaning men, who like him followed the fashion of their age, quieted their consciences. No casuist, however severe, has denied that it may be a duty to give what it is a crime to take. It was infamous in Jeffreys to demand money for the lives of the unhappy prisoners whom he tried at Dorchester and Taunton. But it was not infamous, nay, it was laudable, in the kinsmen and friends of a prisoner to contribute of their substance in order to make up a purse for Jeffreys. The Sally Rover, who threatened to bastinado a Christian captive to death unless a ransom was forthcoming, was an odious ruffian. But to ransom a Christian captive from a Sally Rover was, not merely an innocent, but a highly meritorious act. It would be improper in such cases to use the word corruption. Those who receive the filthy lucre are corrupt already. He who bribes them does not make them wicked, he finds them so, and he merely prevents their evil propensities from producing evil effects. And might not the same plea be urged in defence of a minister who, when no other expedient would avail, paid greedy and low-minded men not to ruin their country? It was by such reasoning as this that the scruples of William were overcome. Honest Burnet, with the uncourtly courage which distinguished him, ventured to remonstrate with the King. "Nobody," William answered, "hates bribery more than I, but I have to do with a set of men who must be managed in this vile way or not at all. I must strain a point or the country is lost." It was necessary for the Lord President to have in the House of Commons an agent for the purchase of members, and Lowther was both too awkward and too scrupulous to be such an agent. But a man in whom craft and profligacy were united in high degree was without difficulty found. This was the Master of the Rolls, Sir John Trevor, who had been Speaker in the single Parliament held by James. High as Trevor had risen in the world, there were people who could still remember him a strange-looking lawyer's clerk in the Inner Temple. Indeed, nobody who had ever seen him was likely to forget him, for his grotesque features and his hideous squint were far beyond the reach of a caricature. His parts, which were quick and vigorous, had enabled him early to master the science of chicane. Gambling and betting were his amusements, and out of these amusements he contrived to extract much business in the way of his profession. for his opinion on a question arising out of a wager or a game at chance had as much authority as a judgment of any court in Westminster Hall. He soon rose to be one of the boon companions which Jeffreys hugged in fits of maudlin friendship over the bottle at night, and cursed and reviled in court on the morrow. Under such a teacher, Trevor rapidly became a proficient in that peculiar kind of rhetoric which had enlivened the trials of Baxter and of Alice Lisle. Reports indeed spoke of some scolding matches between the Chancellor and his friend, in which the disciple had been no less voluble and scurrilous than the master. These contests, however, did not take place till the younger adventurer had attained riches and dignities such that he no longer stood in need of the patronage which had raised him. Among high churchmen, Trevor, in spite of his notorious want of principle, had at this time a certain popularity, which he seems to have owed chiefly to their conviction that, however insecure he might be in general, his hatred of the dissenters was genuine and hearty. There was little doubt that, in a House of Commons in which the Tories had a majority, he might easily, with the support of the court, be chosen Speaker. He was impatient to be again in his old post, which he well knew how to make one of the most lucrative in the kingdom, and he willingly undertook that secret and shameful office for which Lowther was altogether unqualified. Richard Hampden was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. This appointment was probably intended as a mark of royal gratitude for the moderation of his conduct, for the attempts which he had made to curb the violence of his Whig friends, and especially of his son. Godolphin voluntarily left the Treasury. Why, we are not informed. We can scarcely doubt that the dissolution and the result of the general election must have given him pleasure, for his political opinions leaned towards Toryism, and he had, in the late reign, done some things which, though not very heinous, stood in need of an indemnity. It is probable that he did not think it compatible with his personal dignity to sit at the board below Lowther, who was in rank his inferior. A new Commission of Admiralty was issued. At the head of the naval administration was placed Thomas Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, a high-born and high-bred man, who had ranked among the Tories, who had voted for a regency, and who had married the daughter of Sawyer. That Pembroke's Toryism, however, was not of a narrow and illiberal kind is sufficiently proved by the fact that, immediately after the Revolution, the Essay on the Human Understanding was dedicated to him by John Locke, in token of gratitude for kind offices done in evil times. Nothing was admitted which could reconcile Torrington to this change, for though he had been found an incapable administrator, he still stood so high in general estimation as a seaman that the government was unwilling to lose his services. He was assured that no slight was intended to him. He could not serve his country at once on the ocean and at Westminster, and it had been thought less difficult to supply his place in his office than on the deck of his flagship. He was at first very angry, and actually laid down his commission, but some concessions were made to his pride, a pension of £3,000 a year, and a grant of 10,000 acres of Crown land in the Peterborough level were irresistible baits to his cupidity, and in an evil hour for England he consented to remain at the head of the naval force, on which the safety of her coasts depended. While these changes were making in the offices round Whitehall, the commissions of lieutenancy all over the kingdom were revised. The Tories had, during 12 months, been complaining that their share in the government of the districts in which they lived bore no proportion to their number, to their wealth, and to the consideration which they enjoyed in society. They now regained with great delight their former position in their shires. The Whigs raised a cry that the King was foully betrayed, and that he had been induced by evil counsellors to put the sword into the hands of men who, as soon as a favourable opportunity offered, would turn the edge against himself. In a dialogue which was believed to have been written by the newly created Earl of Warrington, and which had a wide circulation at the time, but has long been forgotten, the Lord Lieutenant of a county was introduced expressing his apprehensions that the majority of his deputies were traitors at heart. But nowhere was the excitement produced by the new distribution of power so great as in the capital. By a commission of lieutenancy, which had been issued immediately after the Revolution, the trained bands of the city had been put under the command of staunch Whigs. Those powerful and opulent citizens whose names were admitted complained that the list was filled with elders of Puritan congregations, with Shaftesbury's brisk boys, with Rye House plotters, and that it was scarcely possible to find, mingled with that multitude of fanatics and levellers, a single man sincerely attached to monarchy and to the Church. A new commission now appeared framed by Caermarthen and Nottingham. They had taken counsel with Compton, the bishop of the diocese, and Compton was not a very discreet adviser. He had originally been a High Churchman and a Tory. The severity with which he had been treated in the late reign had transformed him into a Latitudinarian and a rebel, and he had now, from jealousy of Tillotson, turned High Churchman and Tory again. The Whigs complained that they were ungratefully proscribed by a government which owed its existence to them, that some of the best friends of King William had been dismissed, with contumely to make room for some of his worst enemies, for men who were as unworthy of trust as any Irish rapparee, for men who had delivered up to a tyrant the charter and the immemorial privileges of the city, for men who had made themselves notorious by the cruelty with which they had enforced the penal laws against Protestant dissenters, nay, for men who had sat on those juries which had found Russell and Cornish guilty. The discontent was so great that it seemed, during a short time, likely to cause pecuniary embarrassment to the state. The supplies voted by the late Parliament came in slowly. The wants of the public service were pressing. In such circumstances it was to the citizens of London that the government always looked for help, and the government of William had hitherto looked especially to those citizens who professed Whig opinions. Things were now changed. A few eminent Whigs, in their first anger, sullenly refused to advance money. Nay, one or two unexpectedly withdrew considerable sums from the exchequer. The financial difficulties might have been serious had not some wealthy Tories, who, if Sacheverell's clause had become law, would have been excluded from all municipal honours, offered the Treasury £100,000 down, and promised to raise a still larger sum. While the city was thus agitated, came a day appointed by royal proclamation for a general fast. The reasons assigned for this solemn act of devotion were the lamentable state of Ireland, and the approaching departure of the King. Prayers were offered up for the safety of His Majesty's person, and for the success of his arms. The churches of London were crowded. The most eminent preachers of the capital, who were, with scarcely an exception, either moderate Tories or moderate Whigs, exerted themselves to calm the public mind, and earnestly exhorted their flocks not to withhold, at this great conjuncture, a hearty support from the Prince, with whose fate was bound up the fate of the whole nation. Burnet told a large congregation from the pulpit how the Greeks, when the Great Turk was preparing to besiege Constantinople, could not be persuaded to contribute any part of their wealth for the common defence, and how bitterly they repented of their avarice when they were compelled to deliver up to the victorious infidels the treasures which had been refused to the supplications of the last Christian emperor. The Whigs, however, as a party, did not stand in need of such an admonition. Grieved and angry as they were perfectly sensible that on the stability of the throne of William depended all that they most highly prized. What some of them might, at this conjuncture, have been tempted to do if they could have found another leader, if, for example, their Protestant Duke, their King Monmouth, had still been living, may be doubted, but their only choice was between the sovereign whom they had set up and the sovereign whom they had pulled down. It would have been strange indeed if they had taken part with James in order to punish William, when the worst fault which they imputed to William was that he did not participate in the vindictive feeling with which they remembered the tyranny of James. Much as they disliked the bill of indemnity, they had not forgotten the bloody circuit. They therefore, even in their ill humour, continued true to their own king, and while grumbling at him, were ready to stand by him against his adversary with their lives and fortunes. Section 5.